All right. We talked about general and special revelation. And what I am sharing these two times is really about the general revelation that God has given to the Chinese people. And just be aware that both general or special revelation has only one author, one origin. So they do not conflict. While general revelation is not specific, they are guideposts to lead people to Christ. And revelation is progressive. When people respond to the basic truths that God has provided for them, then they will be led by the Holy Spirit into the ultimate revelation that is in Jesus Christ. And my thesis is that the ancient Chinese once worshiped a personal and relational God who rules lovingly and justly through his regent. They also believe and practice vicarious sacrifice to maintain their relationship to this personal God. I shared about the character of God as recorded by Chinese in their ancient classics the last time. I also shared about the most original, indigenous, and continuous religious practice that is the annual border sacrifice. Now, notice that sacrifice, just as in the Hebrew sacrifice, are not meant to save people. They are meant to direct people to the ultimate sacrifice that is in Jesus Christ. And that is amply explained in the book of Hebrews, that even the Leviticus practice cannot save man. So we are not saying that the ancient Chinese were saved through those sacrifices, but they were revealed to them by God so that when Jesus arrives, people will know that he is that sacrifice they're looking forward to. Okay, today we're moving on to, hopefully we have time for three other uh, support for my argument. And those are ideologies embedded in Chinese character. Okay, and then I want to look at the records and interpretations of extra events in Chinese history. Um, Ancient Chinese, like the Babylonians and even the Persians, were astute observers of the skies, and they record them and they interpreted them, and I will share that with you afterwards. And then Magi, these are the wise men from the West. I call them the experts' opinion. Just as in the case, in the court case, we can bring experts to testify. So I am inviting these very wise men to testify their opinion. Okay, we talked about the name above all name, Shangdi and Tian, and how they correspond with the character of God that you can study in any systematic theology in a seminary. And then we talked about the border sacrifice, and remember why it is called a border sacrifice, because it has to be done outside the city and to the east. And that's, again, even in that is very consistent with the Hebrew practice. So today we want to go into words have meaning. Now, the Chinese language, as you are all aware, is unique in the world. It's called Fan Kuai Zi, okay, the square character. It is still iconic, uh, unlike all the other languages. Now, initially, all the written records of the world were iconic. Like if you go to Egypt, you see the hieroglyphs. It took the Rosetta Stone to reveal the meaning, but they are iconic, meaning, like the icons you have on your cell phone, the apps, there are no words, but when you look at the symbol, you know what it means. But the problem with that is that, and I'm sure those of you who struggle through learning Chinese, is that you have to memorize every word. And a college student, Chinese college student, university student, normally has to master about 5,000 words. So that's a challenge. So written words evolve. And by the way, can you all see me and hear me good enough? I need some feedback. Otherwise, I might just be talking to myself.
Yes, yes, very fine.
Okay, good. Because yesterday I did a webinar and the Chinese were too modest and kind, didn't tell me that they actually did not see the wonderful PowerPoint I prepared for them. I was so disappointed. After 2 hours, and I was wondering when I was referring to the pictures and nobody said a word. So anyway, good. All right. So written language evolved into phonetic system, the alphabets that we have, because it is easier for people to learn the language. And there is a new discovery, by the way, if you're interested, if you can Google patterns of evidence. Typically, the experts think that the Phoenicians were the inventor of the alphabets. Then you went from Phoenicia to the West, and we have the Greek alphabet, and then the Latin alphabet, and all that. But now there is a new discovery, and I actually believe them that it is the Hebrews that had first come out with the alphabet. And guess who? It was probably Joseph who designed them, but that's another story. Okay, the Chinese kept the iconic system, and we have very good records because unlike the Egyptians who wrote on papyrus or later, sheepskin, the Chinese had their written language and engraved in oracle bones such as this, or in bronze objects. And because they are iconic, you find that they do evolve, but not entirely different. Now, with the phonetic system, the alphabet system, when pronunciation change, they have to change the writing, right? They have to match the spoken word. So if you look at the early edition of the King James Bible, you are all familiar with that. If you look at, just Google it and look at a King James Bible from maybe even 200 years ago, I will tell you, you cannot recognize them, all right? They are supposed to be English words, but they're very different in appearance because they are pronounced differently. But with the Chinese iconic system, you will see that even though it has evolved, it is more a stylistic change, and you can still trace them quite easily. Now, with the iconic system, basically, and I'm just generalizing, three main categories. You have the concrete, meaning that the word looks like the real object. Like this is a word yang for sheep, and this is a word for mountain, sun, you can see, like the mountain range. And then you see this is a person. It's a person walking, okay? His legs are apart. And then the second category are idiomatic. Now, because not every word has a concrete picture, so a lot of the words are idiomatic. You put concepts together and then you form a word. So like this is a word for rest, xiu. You have here the radical. This is the other thing about the iconic language. You use the word radical in Chinese is 部首. It's a category of word. So when you look at it, now you may not be able to pronounce it, but you can see this is a man, all right? It's this man that is now turned into a radical, so he stood up. And then you have a tree here. So the picture is a man leaning on the tree. So he is resting. And this is a word I'm sure most of you know, 好, 女子. Some people say, women are good. No, actually, the idea is when you have a boy and a girl, wow, that's, it's good. It's completion, all right? And then this is the word for Tian, heaven. Last time I talked about it. It's from the word Ta, and it is one bigger than Ta, one bigger than the greatest. So it is the supreme one, that is God. Okay, the third kind of words are the vocal, the one that will give you the sound. So like, this is the original word for meow, and then you add a radical for a animal, it becomes mao, all right? That's the sound of a cat. So basically these three categories, and I will focus more on the first two, especially the second one. Now, when it comes to idiomatic symbols, such as this one. Now, you all know what this means, right? It's danger. It doesn't mean that there are scars there. It simply means that if you get near that, you will touch it, you will eat it, you will become like that. All right. We use symbols around us today on the highway, in buildings. We don't use words. We use symbols because symbols gives us the meaning right away. People do not need to know how to pronounce it. They just need to see it. Even a kid looking at this will know, oh dear, don't get near that. That is the idea of idiomatic symbols. And this is the other thing that is even more powerful, is the continuity of idiomatic symbols, the embedded meaning in it. These are the international symbols for toilets, right? It's very important that we all know. This was invented by the Japanese in 1964 when they received the award to Tokyo for the Olympics. Now, you know that the Japanese is a monolingual culture, and they know that unless they use some symbols, their guests from all over the world will not know where to go, especially this is the most important place for a person traveling every day, right? Every time we have a stop, that's the first place we go to. So it's the most important place that people need to go to. And the Japanese are very smart. They realize, if they list all the written languages for the rest of the world, there's no space on the door. So they came up with these two symbols. All right. Now it is the international standard, pretty much. There's some places that use funny symbols and then you get confused, which is which. But this is very clear. All right. Look at here. This symbol for the ladies' room has a woman wearing skirt. Let's assume that 4,000 years later, no more skirt, all right, no more dress. Men and women dress all the same, just assume that. But this symbol will not change with fashion. Fashion can change, but this symbol has already got a place in the world, and it doesn't need to change because you don't need to pronounce it. You just need to look at it and people will understand that this means the ladies' room. 4,000 years later, no more dresses. But our descendants can look at this symbol and say, aha, in ancient times, the women wear something like that. You see the point? That by studying these iconic symbols, we can actually tell what our ancient forefathers knew and what they think about certain subjects. That's the important thing. And I want to review to you some of these. This is the most popular Chinese word, right? Especially during Chinese New Year, you see people hanging it all over the places. Some go upside down. This is the Chinese word for blessing. This is the most important word for the Chinese people. We all want a blessing. When I share Christ, the fourth spiritual law is God loves you and has a wonderful plan for your life. That is a Western concept. But with the Chinese, I share God loves you and has a blessing for you. And that makes a lot of sense. Okay, this is a word that the Chinese loves, and yet many times it is misinterpreted. Now, people will think, blessing means having, something to dress, 衣服, and 一口田, something to eat and a piece of land. But that is a wrong interpretation. First of all, that radical, the 部首, is not 衣服, it's reveal, 是. Because God is a self-revealing one. The ancient Chinese used this symbol to represent God. Every word that has this 部首, 是, which means God, it's a spiritual word. So the very first thing that we need to understand is that blessing here, it is a spiritual word, not a material word. You see, E is written like this. I mean, just like in the Hebrew language, one dot makes a difference. You see on the top left, it is the 是, 部首, but the bottom shows you the one E. This is why some people mistaken blessing to mean having something to dress. It is wrong. Because God we can only know God when God reveals himself. The ancient Chinese knew that, and they use that for the symbol of God. And then this part on the top right, people mistake that for 一口田, but it is actually a concrete symbol. It is a symbol of a jar and a jar of wine, particularly. Now, the part that has been simplified, and that happens in the Chinese words, because sometimes, like we all know the simplified version of Chinese language, to make it easier for people through time, sometimes the parts are reduced. So the part that has been removed are this element on the bottom. Anybody can tell me what that is? It's a pair of hands that is raised up, all right? And the jar actually refers to a covenantal relationship. It's just like when Jesus raised the cup and said, this cup which is poured out for you is the new covenant in my blood. So it is a picture of a covenantal relationship with God. So what is blessing? When you put all this together, this idiom is a very powerful and very clear picture of the ancient Chinese understanding of what blessing is. It is having a relationship with God. That is blessing. Blessed is the man, right, who walks with God, all right, who and all the beatitude. So you will see that the ancient Chinese understood the true meaning of blessing. And here I have the scripture for lifting up our hands. We lift up our hands to praise God. And those of us who know him and praise him know that our most blessed experience is when we are worshiping God. Nothing beats that. All right. And this is the Chinese word to forbid, 禁,禁止的禁. All right. You have two trees, and then remember this symbol on the bottom? 是, right, to review. So it is God and two trees. So when the ancient Chinese thought of a word to depict, forbid, they remember the first thing, the first restriction placed on man, because God wanted man to exercise his will, so he put two trees there, and the Chinese remember that, and then this is a related word to restrain. Very interestingly, you have mu and then kou. So when the Chinese thought about a word for restraint, the very first word they remember was the first restraint placed on man: do not eat from that tree. But there was a third person, a neutral person, not a man or a woman, not God, that was in the garden. And we all know that is Satan, the snake. Now, this is the Chinese word for the third person. But interestingly, it is also in ancient times the same word for snake. So you tell me, is that a coincidence? I tell you not. I think the ancient Chinese remembered the creation story, knew the Genesis story. Now remember, at the dispersion that happened, that was described in Genesis 11, the languages were mixed up, confused, but God did not give them amnesia. I believe the group that went to China remembered, and when they designed the words. Now, this is the thing about symbols, correct? That you need symbols that people know easily so that, it can become in use. Of course, there is a process of elimination. It's just like the apps you see on your cell phone. They evolve, and then after a while, certain ones are so popular, they stick. So they remembered that there was a third person they eat in the garden, and it was also the snake. So now a radical is added to it, the Thong, all right, the reptile or the insect radical is added to separate the two. But originally, if you look at ancient languages, sir and ta is the same word. Now, this is a Chinese word for to covet. To covet means to desire or want to have what you should not have. And notice here there are two trees, but now instead of God is a woman, and that becomes 贪婪的婪, okay, covet. So you tell me, is it a coincidence? Because we all know that the woman was the one who fell. Now, by the way, don't blame the woman, because if you if you look at the scripture, you notice that her husband was with her when she was tempted. And this is all the more uh, the problem of the man, because he allowed somebody to tease his wife, to tempt her, and he said nothing. So somebody wrote a book called The Silence of Adam. So anyway, but it was nonetheless a woman that gave way, and we have sin into the world. This is the Chinese word for sin. You see here on the bottom, it is like, going in opposite direction. All right, it's like a pair of wings going in opposite direction. That means to contradict. And then the result is on top here, it is a snare, it's a net. So what is sin? A sin is you contradict the standard. And what is that standard? We all know it's God. So when Adam and Eve contradicted God's command, they fell into a snare. Now, this is another Chinese word. It is no longer in use, but you can still see in Chinese dictionary. This is another form of the word sin, 罪. Qin Shi Huang, the emperor who conquered the other 6 nations and built the Great Wall, he changed this word. He decided he doesn't like it because it looks too much like his name, Huang. So it is no longer in use. But if you look at it, Chinese dictionary, you will see that. If you like, you can see here, I can choose a word and type it. But this is even closer in meaning to the biblical understanding of sin. The top part is 字, it's your nose. All right, it means you, 自我的自. And then the bottom, you see here, this is 辛苦, pain, bitterness. So when the person is self-centered, sin is self-centeredness, the result is pain. Very interesting, isn't it? And I have a scripture here, but I won't take the time. Now, Satan tempted man and woman, and the result is they fell into sin, and the result is death. This is a Chinese word for death. Here you have the tree. And then you have 2 mouths here, right? 2 mouths represents 2 people. So it goes back to the Garden of Eden. This is how death enters the world when the man and woman fell and ate from that tree. Now, this is a very interesting word. Now this is a word that has the E, clothing as a 部首, right? Notice that this is an extra dot here. And this word has to do with clothing. And on the right side is fruit. So you tell me, what is the relationship between nakedness and fruit? There's no other logical explanation except that we know that in the Garden of Eden, when they ate from the fruit, they realized that they were naked, right? So there is, coincidence. We all know that the best explanation is usually the simplest one. So here you can see that the ancient Chinese did know something about the creation story, and they chose this word that they were familiar with, that the fruit resulted in people, knowing that they are naked. Now, what was Satan's purpose in tempting Adam and Eve? Really, God wanted to live in the hearts of man and woman. He wants to be in communion with us. But Satan wants to usurp that, and so he tempted them, and the result is guilt. Now, the Chinese word for guilt is 心里有鬼, having the devil in your heart. This is the radical for heart, and this is the word for the devil. So guilt is not a feeling. Guilt is a condition. Guilt is that when we sin, we let the devil into our heart. And sin also resulted in something very bad. This is the Chinese word for older brother, 兄, right? 兄长的兄. And the older brother is a spokesman of the family. So you can see the mouth. And then this is the word for son. So he's the son who speaks for the family. And this word is pronounced the same nowadays. It's 兄. And you will see here, the ancient form is actually very graphic. And it's, again, there's no other explanation that is better than the one in the Bible. It is Cain, who was jealous of his younger brother. He murdered him. So you can see this is a word for murder. and it is the older brother hitting the younger brother, and then there is a mark on his head. Well, voila! This is exactly what the Bible tells us, that when Cain murdered his youngest brother, Abel, and God forgave him and put a mark on his forehead. Now, you tell me, is this coincidence? I don't think so, because again, this is the best explanation for why the Chinese chose to design this word shown in this way. And then, in order to bring man back into fellowship with himself, God provided a sacrifice. We all know that the first sacrifice was performed when he killed the lambs so that Adam and Eve could have something to wear. And this is a Chinese word for sacrifice. And you see here, God here. And now you notice here, this is an evolution. The very left is the most ancient form, what they call the Jiaguwen, the auricle bone. And these are the bronze inscription. You see that originally they just have a hand with a piece of meat with blood, So because the result of sin is death, and so to cure that, somebody has to sacrifice, death has to happen. So here you can see this is a sacrifice performed by God. Okay, this is a Chinese word for vessel, 器皿的皿. But when you add a stroke on top, it becomes blood. So why is that? So covenants were very important in ancient China. And in a covenant, blood is always shed. And the covenanting parties will always mix the blood in this cup or chalice to signify this. First of all, we know from the scripture that life is in the blood. Interestingly, right? That few thousand years ago, the Hebrews already knew about that, and modern science only discovered that about 200 years ago. Anyway, they will mix the blood, representing that the lives of the covenant parties are all mixing, they're intertwined, they're no longer separated. Now, there's something here I want to share, that when we do communion, next time when you do communion, do not stop at evaluating your relationship with God alone, because in the covenant, everybody is part of that. So I find that in churches, we emphasize only our personal relationship with God during Holy Communion. But in fact, we should do that, but we must also add our relationship with everybody in the church. And this is the thing that I hate about people hopping from church to church, because when you are in a church, you are in the covenanting relationship with everybody in that community. So do not switch so easily. All right. Now, related to that is this idea of a covenant, right? You see the cup, the blood evolving, and now here you have the word for covenant. And it is the same word from the blood, and now they added the sun and the moon. And the sun and the moon means to declare. So this is part of the reason why we have regular Holy Communion, to declare our relationship with God and with one another. And Jesus talks about that. He said, for as often as you eat this bread and drink the cup, you proclaim the Lord's death until he comes. Sorry, this is what Paul said. So a covenantal relationship is not a private relationship. It has to be public. Our faith is personal, but should never be private. Our faith is personal. It should be acted out, proclaimed in the public square. Now, this is a great temptation of our days. Governments love that. They say you can believe as long as you don't bring it to the public square. But that is not covenantal relationship. A covenantal relationship is public. We wear a ring. Sorry, I woke up, forgot to put on my ring when we are married. Why do we do that? We wear the ring to proclaim that we are in a covenantal relationship with our spouse. So in the same way, the ancient Chinese understood that a covenant has to be proclaimed. And that sacrifice has to be special. This is the Chinese word for special, 特别的特. Originally, this word means the animal itself. All right, in the book of Li Ji, which is corresponding to the book of Leviticus, it has a whole book to explain about the sacrifice. And that animal that were used is referred to as ter. This is a cow radical, and this is the Chinese word for a sanctuary. So anyway, you can see that ter, it's related to the sacrifice, and it has to be special. Down to the point of the size of the horn, and the color has to be perfect, no blemish. And the result is that of righteousness. Now, this is the Chinese word for yi. As in our English speaking world, sometimes when people talk about that is a righteous person, we think of that as a personal quality. It may be so, but actually, before that, righteousness is a condition. It's being right with God. It is a legal position. It is not an innate personal quality. Of course, out of that right relationship with God, we go on in our sanctification, become a righteous person. But the first and foremost thing is that it is being right with God. We see here that in the Chinese, this is the oracle bone form. You can see the lamb with a dagger piercing it. So righteousness has to do with sacrifice. And this is a fan ti zi, right? This is a classical form. You see the lamb with the tail cut off, and then me, wo, at the bottom. So righteousness is when I accept the Lamb of God, and God sees me now through the Lamb. And this is the variant form, and now it is being used in the simplified, but it was not invented by Chairman Mao in the 60s when he simplified Chinese characters. This was another form, and it was an ancient form. And this is a chalice. It's the same, the qimin, the cup. And now there's a blood. So once again, righteousness has to do with a covenantal relationship. And to further illustrate that righteousness and sacrifice are related. Sorry, I typed it wrong. This one should be sacrifice. This is season the sea. All right. Season sacrifice has two parts. You have the cow radical on the left, and then righteousness on the right. So it clearly tells you that ancient Chinese understood that righteousness has to do with that sacrifice. Now, this is a variant form. Again, the iconic system has variant forms. This one, instead of this is the spear, all right? A man is a very fierce one. He carries this is his hand, and he carries a spear on the right. But here, they change it to xiu. Xiu, it means perfect, all right? Xiu li, perfect, beautiful. So, in other words, they understood that the sacrifice that is acceptable has to be perfect. The result is that when we accept Christ, like in the case of Noah, accept God, and he saved his family. So when the ancient Chinese thought of a word to describe that big boat, they thought of the ark. All right, on the left side is the word for ark, so, and then 八口, 8 mouths. Now, coincidence? I don't think so, because that ark that saved Noah and his family, exactly 8 of them. Noah, his wife, and his 3 sons, and their wives. So altogether, 8 of them. So this is, again, the ancient Chinese knowledge of the creation. Now, I not only have the words. Now, sometimes people say, oh, it's like looking at clouds. You can tell, you can say what it means. You can, oh, that looks like a cow, that looks like a sheep. But I do have another source of evidence to support what I say. It was discovered in the 80s, a major civilization in the Sichuan province. That place is called Sanxingdui. You can Google it. There were many artifacts. They discovered that they estimated that about 3,000 to 4,000, almost 5,000 years ago, there was a civilization there. And this is a major discovery. It changed a lot of experts' opinion on the development of China. Now, you all might know that the theory in the past is that the Chinese people started in the Yellow River Delta in the north. But Now they find this major civilization that had up to 2 million people, and they found many artifacts. But there's one distinct, the largest piece of artifact that passes them. It is this piece of a bronze tree. It is 3.95 meters tall. All right. It's like a life-size tree, huge. And the quality of the bronze and all that. Now they know through the dating method that this tree is at least 27 to 4,700 years old. This means that this bronze object was made before the Bible was written down. And on that tree, there are knives protecting fruits. You see the fruit there? And then there are knives that protect them. And there are beautiful birds on the tree. And interestingly, I do not know whether you can make it out. First of all, look at the left side. You will see here a snake winding down the tree. All right. This looks like a snake. And this is a closer picture on the right. You can see his eye. And interestingly, you see he has leg. He has a leg here. All right. This is a snake that walks. And you see a hand reaching out to the tree. Now, take a closer look, especially the one on the right side of the picture. Tell me, is this a lady or a man's hand? I personally think that it's very clearly it's a woman's hand, right? It's long and tender, great for playing the piano. I think it's a woman's hand. And then you have knife, as if to say what? Don't do it, right? The knife means don't do it. So you tell me, what does this tree mean? Now, Chinese experts still call this the San Xin Tui bronze tree puzzle. They say, what does this mean? Why did our ancient forefathers make this huge object? Again, I would suggest to you that the simplest answer is the best answer. The simplest explanation for this tree is that this is a depiction of the fall in the Garden of Eden. And as I think I shared before, that the Chinese and the Hebrews had no interactions at that time. So I think that knowledge came when the first Chinese migrants that came after the Tower of Babel brought with them the memory of God and the creation story. And they wanted their children to remember that this is the major turning point in history and probably never to do it again. They made this tree, bronze tree. I love this quote. It's a linguist, Calgren. He said, language, literary language, is the greatest artistic creation of a civilized nation. It is not shaped by philologists at their desk, but by the giants of thought who have something to say to their contemporaries and who carve the monuments from the solid granite of the spoken language. So this is a beautiful thing. I love the Chinese language. I'm English educated, but I love the Chinese language because of this, that when you study them, you can actually get into the minds of the ancient, because what they knew, what they think about are inscribed in those characters that they design. And it is like opening a window. It's like on our cell phone, when we touch an icon, a window is open. So when you touch on these icons, windows are open to us into our ancient past. Now, with that, I want to pause. Maybe you all have a couple of questions, and then I will take a break, and then we will come back. Any question about this first part? Any discussion? Now I want to move on to another area I call Magi from the West. Interestingly, you talk about prophecy. The ancient Chinese had a prophecy that the holy man is from the West. 西方有圣人, and that is in the Tao Te Ching. So for a long time, there's a fascination of going west. you all know the story of 西游记, right? The Su Wukong, the Monkey King. That was, of course, a mythological story that is based on a historical fact. This Tan Sheng, this monk from the Tang Dynasty, wanted to go to the West to Jin to find the scripture. But interestingly, he ended up in India. We all know that India is not the West, it's the South. So he went the wrong way. All right. But there had been wise men from the West to China, and they made a huge impact. In 1999, at the end of the year, the Chinese rushed and they completed this massive monumental project in Beijing, and it is to usher in the 21st century. This was a pet project of Jiang Zemin. If you go to Beijing and you can visit this place, it's called the Millennium Monument. And in it, the showpiece is called 中华千秋颂, a tribute to Chinese history. It is depicted on this wall relief, 5,000 years of Chinese civilization. All the major events and people, like you can see here on the right, is Sun Zhongshan and Confucius, the printing press, and this guy is Kangxi. But interestingly, on this wall, there is actually one Westerner, and I will get you the close-up. It's this guy with a telescope and a globe. This man was Matthew Ricci. Who was he? He was very honored along with all the other Jesuit missionaries to China. Now, I want to say something about the Jesuits. Not everyone who disagreed with the corruption in the Catholic Church left. So there was an internal reformation. And that internal reformation was started by a guy called Ignatius of Loyola. And if you read his book, The Spiritual Discipline, you will actually find that he is very evangelical. I think he's even more evangelical than today's evangelical. So that's why he named his new society the Jesuits, which is a return to the focus on Jesus. Now, of course, we all know, if you follow that history, it got corrupted also later when he went to Latin America and he got involved in politics and all that. So that's why sometimes when I mention Jesuits, there are people who objected. I said, well, just like the word Christians, there are good Christians, especially at the beginning, and then we got corrupted. So they are very bad Christians. You cannot just say that all Christians are bad just because of some bad eggs. So in the same way, the Jesuits actually started out very well. And as a result of that internal reformation, a strong missionary zeal happened, and they sent Jesuit missionaries all over the world. And some of them ended up in China. This is a cemetery dedicated to them, which is just right outside the Second Ring Road in Beijing. If you have been to Beijing, the Second Ring Road actually was the imperial wall of Beijing city in the past, but they tore it down, and some Chinese lament that. They say they wish to have that. But anyway, for quote-unquote progress, Chairman Mao tore it down and built the Second Ring Road. But within 2 kilometers to the east of Guanyuan Qiao, there is this party school that actually was a seminary owned by the Jesuits, because the emperor gave them this piece of land and they buried the missionaries. And if you look at the headstones, you can tell that these men were greatly honored by the emperor. All these were commissioned by the emperor. And nobody gets buried, within the city, by the way. So this tells you that these guys were special. And the 3 main ones, you can see here, the largest one is that to commemorate Matthew Ricci. And then to the left is Shaw, and then to the right is Werbis. I want to mention them afterwards. Now, all these headstones were buried underground during the Cultural Revolution. Some guys, the people there had the presence of mind. They know that the Red Guards would destroy them. So all those headstones you can see Now some were destroyed, but there were 30 something left still. They were buried and then they were brought up again after the Cultural Revolution. And you can see how honored they were, giving them the dragon symbol. Even though I if I have a chance, I'll tell you about the dragon. I do not like it, but anyway, it is an imperial symbol by the time of the Qing Dynasty, and all their accomplishments, their contribution to China are written here. Now, these are all headstones of foreign missionaries to China. The first one, the most prominent one, is a man called Matthew Ritchie, Chinese name Li Ma Dou. He was not the first missionary to China, but he became the most prominent. And he went there during the late Ming Dynasty, during the reign of the last emperor of the Ming Dynasty. No, I shouldn't say the last, not quite the last, but close to the last, Wan Li. He went there, and first he adopted, the monk approach, the Buddhist approach, and then he realized that the Buddhists were really, not well accepted, and he doesn't believe in being identified with them. Then later he went on and he identified himself as a Confucius scholar. There are many stories about him, but he was a brilliant man. His memory was so fantastic. The Jesuits had a way of memorizing. Just to explain to you. Now, if I ask you, where is your passport? You can probably tell me. You can just, even if you're away from home, you're at your office, you want to send somebody to your home to collect your passport, you say, get into my house, you walk past the living room, and then to the right, it's my bedroom. You go into my bedroom, and you see a desk on the right, on the second drawer, in the middle section. You will open it, you see my passport. Okay, so the Jesuits built on that idea. They have what they call a memory palace. Now in those days, you remember, they don't have iPhone, they don't have ways of recording, so they built palaces in their mind, and then they shelve their information in those palaces, in those compartments, and they were such great memorizer. So Matthew Ritchie fascinated the Chinese. At a event in Nanjing, he was invited by a government leader, and they heard of his memory skill. They asked him to demonstrate, and they brought out a book, and they asked him to read, and he turned it down and he recited it word for word. And the host was impressed, but he said, you probably read the book before. He said, no, I never read this book before. It's the first time. The host said, no, I don't believe you. So he said, okay, all right, get a piece of paper out. And he had like 1,000 guests, and he said, everyone write a word, just random word. So they wrote, and he looked at it, and he turned it down, and he recited it word for word. And that was how impressive he was. Now, there are people who can actually do that even nowadays with great memory skill. But more important than that, he was a mathematician, and he was an evangelist. And he decided to go to Beijing. And after a while, he got to know some very prominent people. And the Emperor Wan Li was actually very interested to meet with him. But by the time the Ming Dynasty was very corrupt, it was known that one emperor had never held court in 12 years. Wang Li himself was very fat, so he wouldn't see people. And so Ritchie never get a chance to meet him, but they had communications indirectly, and he gave him a clock and a map of the world. And the People's Daily credits Ritchie for the introduction of the world map, Western mathematics, and astronomy to China. While there, Ritchie recognized that the calendar was a very important part of China. If in the old days, I do not know whether your parents used the book, the red almanac. In Chinese, it's called Tong Shen, because they do not want to call it Tong Su. It's a book on all the information that you need. and it particularly about which are the auspicious day. Now remember, they are an agrarian society, so they needed to do their planting right. They need to know what to do, So a lot of it depended on the calendar and the accuracy of it. So Ritchie realized that the Chinese calendar was not good enough. So he appealed to Rome and asked for qualified astronomer to come to join him. And that person was Johann Adam Shaw, Tang Ro Wang. He came in the final years of the Ming Dynasty. Ming Dynasty fell. Oh, by the way, he was recruited and he started to work in the astronomical department of the Ming Dynasty. But the Ming Dynasty fell and he decided to stay on. And the new emperor, the Qing Emperor Sun Tzu, liked him so much, recruited him, and he became the director of that astronomical society that determines the calendar. But there were people who were jealous of him, so there were a lot of competitions, and in the end, he was scandalized. Even though he was actually doing his job very well, he was thrown in prison. But before he died, he was able to make a very significant contribution to China. Now, Sun Tzu actually liked him so much. And one of the reasons why they were jealous of him was Sun Tzu started to call him father, right? You know, you call a Catholic priest father. And the rest of the Qing emperor will say, Kei Thong, you know, this is against our culture. How can the emperor call another person father? You know, this is totally out of whack. So they were very jealous of him. But Sun Tzu actually loved him a lot, except that Sun Tzu fell in love with a concubine who was a very devout Buddhist. So refused baptism, but they had lots of conversations. But before Sun Tzu died of smallpox at a very young age, 20-something, he asked Shaw for his opinion who his successor would be. And Shaw told him to select the next emperor, Kangxi. And Kangxi rose to become the most, probably one of the best emperors of all of China. He reigned for 61 years. You have a chance, I will talk about his story. Kangxi started a development in China that had a huge impact. But anyway, this is a cosmological map that Shaw produced for China. And you will see here that this cathedral in Beijing, it's still there, was built to honor him. And his sidekick, now Shaw died, and his sidekick, Werbis, took over, and Werbis became the personal tutor of Kangxi. Kangxi became the emperor, like I said. His father died young, so he was only 9 years old. So he had a regent until he was about 14 years old, and then he finally ruled. But all along the way, Kangxi was tutored by Werbis. And so Werbis later rose up. Actually, his rank was like the prime minister of China. Have you ever heard of that? You do not know that, right? But there was once a prime minister of China that was a foreigner. And when he died, Kangxi honored him with a funeral fit for the queen. They held lots of conversations and had a very good relationship. And my theory that Kangxi himself wrote in his final memorial before he died, he said, you know, all the emperors before me, when they ruled for a long time, they never end up well. He said, you know, that is part of human nature. But he turned out to be the longest serving emperor of China since Qin Shi Huang. He ruled for 61 years. Now his grandson, Qianlong, ruled for 60 years. Qianlong, to honor Kangxi, actually abdicated the throne Again, a very rare feat in China, but again, the Jesuit influence was there. So Kangxi was a little emperor, and yet he remained, I would say, a righteous king, accomplished great things, both militarily and in terms of government. It's like the King James Bible of China is the Kangxi Da Zidian, the great dictionary of China, produced by Kangxi. All of that, and he had written poems that indicated he had a clear understanding of salvation. If you go to China, you go to Beijing, you'll probably see this in Jianguomen. These are astronomical equipments that were commissioned and built by Werbist. Another, this is I think the name is St. Stephen's Church, built by Kangxi in honor of Werbist. Now, when I went to that cemetery, I had been there many times. I know the curator there. I think he's no longer there. He retired. I was in conversation with him. I asked him, I said, there are suggestions that the Jesuits come to take advantage of China and they are spies. And that guy just shook his head. He said, no, it cannot be. He is China's foremost experts on the Jesuits. He even went to their hometowns to visit them. He says, no, it cannot be. He said, these guys left the country, never returned home. In fact, when Ricci wrote home to Macerata in Italy, his family complained that Ricci's Italian had gone, crooked because he had never returned home. He said these guys gave their lives to China. He said there is no indication they were spies for the foreign countries, and they make great contributions. And I asked this professor, I said, what do you think was their greatest contribution to China? And he said, well, the clock, math and all that. But I said, what about their faith? And his face turned a little bit red. I said, you ask Ricci and Shaw and Werbist, what are the most important things in life? What would they say? And he had to agree with me. He says, yeah, of course, it is their faith that brought them to China. So here you can see that they were determined to bring the gospel to China. Now, I share about them. I want to lay the foundation because these are experts, all right? They are experts, professionals in precise science, mathematics, map making, calendar. And this is Ricci's conclusion, and he wrote it in a book called Tian Zu Shi Yi, The True Meaning of the Lord of Heaven. It's written in Wen Yan Wen, all right? My Chinese friends, when they saw that, they were humbled. They said, wow, this guy is Chinese. It's much better than us. Of course, because he lived at the time, he worked in the court. That was language they still use. So here this is the conclusion. He who is called the Lord of Heaven in my humble country, Lord of Heaven is Tianzu, right? The Catholic Tianzu Jiao, Lord of Heaven, is he who is called Shangdi in Chinese. This is the original Chinese. And then, therefore, having lived through a great number of ancient books. Now, when Ricci said having lived through a great number of ancient books, he was a master learner and he worked in the court. He had access to the Hanlin Academy, which is like the Chinese equivalent of the Library of Congress. Unfortunately, that was burned by the Boxers in the 1900s, all right? So a lot of those books are no longer available to us. So Matthew Ricci had sources that we do not have anymore. And moreover, he understood the ancient Chinese language much better than even today's best Chinese academics. So it is quite clear to me that the sovereign on high, okay, sovereign on high is Shangdi, and the Lord of Heaven are different only in name. So here you have it. This is an expert's opinion. And they influence a lot of people. Like I said, Kangxi. Now, Kangxi refused baptism because one of the requirements that the Jesuits had for them was that they can only have one wife. There was a very famous minister, compatriot of Paul Xi Guanqi. Now you go to Shanghai today, there is a museum there to honor this fellow. He was considered one of the most influential Ming minister. All right, he is like the prime minister during the Ming dynasty. But one of his compatriot, Li Zizao, was refused baptism until he renounced his concubines. So that's how serious the Jesuits were. And so Kangxi never did receive baptism, even though he was very close. And the last the last time I shared about the border sacrifice, that a controversy arose because the Jesuits actually participated. Remember, Verbies became the prime minister. So of course he would participate in the border sacrifice. So complaints were made against the Jesuits by the Dominicans and the Franciscans. Now, part of it is misunderstanding because the Dominicans and Franciscans work with the grassroots, whereas the Jesuits work with the top, the elite of society. So what the Dominicans and the Franciscans saw were Chinese idolatry. So when they found out that the Jesuits were involved in this Chinese sacrifice, they wrote and they complained to the Pope. And then there is also another aspect of it, is that of jealousy, right? The Jesuits were living, with the highest honor. They were, prime minister. So imagine the treatment they received. And the Franciscans and the Dominicans lived very poorly, the Franciscans especially. And now the present Pope is a Franciscan monk, famous for, working with the grassroots of society. So there was some jealousy there. And the result of that was what is called the rights controversy, something if you're interested in, you can read. And Rome and China got into a huge argument. The last time I mentioned to you, Kangxi responded and explained that no, he was not worshiping his ancestors. He brought them along to worship and all of that. So the end of that was Kangxi felt really offended that the envoy sent by Rome was not understanding. So he decided, well, I don't want to do anything with you guys. So he kept the Jesuits that were useful to him, and he expelled all the missionaries, including the Franciscans and the Dominicans. Now, in a sense, that saved China from turning into a Catholic country. Otherwise, it was on track to become one. All right, so we have the Catholics' conclusion, but what about the Protestant, right? So in the 19th century, there arose a man called James Lake. Now, you heard about evangelical missions to China. You probably heard about Robert Morrison. Now, this is a successor to Robert Morrison. James Lake was considered the foremost Chinese expert in the 19th century, and that honor is even accepted by Chinese experts themselves, like this guy called Wang Tao himself was China's foremost sinologist, and he honored James Lake. James Lake, when he left China, he returned to Oxford. He became the first professor of Chinese. He spent 25 years to study and translate the Chinese classics. At his memorial, this is said of him, for if ever man loved a people, James Lake loved the Chinese, and he could not bear to see them do wrong or suffer it. The longest and the most embittered controversy in which he was ever engaged was one with certain missionaries who did not think of the root ideas of the old Chinese religion as he did. Nominally, it related to the question whether they had any word that could be used to translate the idea of God. Really and substantially, it concerned whether they had any idea of God at all. And he maintained they had, for did he not judge with charity as well as knowledge? So this was the principal of Mansfield College and his eulogy at James Lake's memorial service. The controversy was this. When this is a time when the Chinese Bible was being translated, And James Lake and most of the British missionaries preferred the term Shangdi. Remember last week we talked about that. This is an indigenous Chinese term, but the other missionaries, particularly those from America, whose scholarship was not as good as the British, insisted that they shouldn't, because they feel that Shangdi is like calling God Su Wukong, because it was an indigenous Chinese term. So they prefer the word Shen. So today, if you buy a Chinese Bible, you can choose the Herben, the standard version. You can choose a Shangdi version or a Shen version, because the division was actually quite strong. So if you read the Chinese Shen Bible, you will see there is an empty space before it. Now, many people today mistakenly think that that is the way to honor God. You leave a space before Shen to honor God, but it's actually not that. It's because the printer needed to print two versions, because there are people who prefer to use Shangdi Banpen, the Shangdi version or the Shen version. So to minimize their cost, they use only one typeset, and they only remove the empty space and put Shangdi, because Shangdi has two words, Shen has only one. So anyway, the debate was actually quite fierce, and it caused a lot of consternation. Now nowadays it's no longer with us, and people mistakenly think that Shangdi is a foreign term that was imposed on China, but really it was an indigenous Chinese term. Now, 30 years after Lake's death, a Congress of Oriental Languages was held in Oxford in 1928, and during the conference, a representation of professors from countries such as France, Italy, Holland, Germany, and so forth. This is what they honor James with, to the immortal genius of the great master James Lake, from the sinologists assembled at the 17th Congress of Orientalists. I share this to set the stage for you to know that James Lake was highly respected, and he was respected by his colleagues. And what was his conclusion? This is James Lake's conclusion. He actually wrote a whole thesis on it, and some of which I use in my book. I maintain that the Chinese do know the true God, and have a word in their language answering to our word God, to the Hebrew Elohim, and to the Greek Theos. So here you have it. All right, these are experts, people who spend their lives studying China and Chinese languages and classics, and they come to that conclusion. And then finally, I want to share something very exciting with you. The heavens declare the glory of God. Just as in the Bible, the Chinese believe that God uses the heavenly bodies to send messages to men. Now, this is not astrology. In the astrology believes that the stars and the moons and the movement control our lives. So this is not a matter of control, but this is a matter of communication. Because even in the Bible, we know that, like in Psalm 19, the heavens declare the glory of God, day by day, it sends out his speech. So the God who flung the stars into space would also use them to communicate messages to us. And usually, now this is another difference between astrology and what I'm talking about here. Astrology is about my personal well-being or personal fortune, whereas these extra phenomena are for the people. All right, a major event, it's not a personal thing. So the Chinese were astute student of the skies. Every dynasty would have a team, and during the Ming Dynasty, they had 14 officials, 14 observing every night the movements of the stars and all, and they write them down, and it's all recorded in Chinese history, and they interpreted them. You will find some interpretation to be quite amazing. So this was one event that they recorded and interpreted. In the second month of the second year, the comet was out of Altair for more than 70 days. It is said comets appear to signify the old being replaced by the new. Altair, the sun, the moon, and the five stars are in movement to signify the beginning of a new epoch. the beginning of a new year, a new month, and a new day. The appearance of this comet undoubtedly symbolizes change. The standard appearance of this comet indicates that this is of great importance. This is the original Chinese, recorded in the Han Dynasty. And then in the second year of Jianping, all right, this is another reference to the same event. And this is the interpretation, all right? It talks about perfect sacrifice. So it talks about a new beginning and a sacrifice. Now, this observation corresponds with the star in the east in the Bible. And we all know that it signifies the coming of Jesus. Of course, that will be a new epoch, it's a new season. And also that he came to sacrifice himself. Now, interestingly, now that the star early on appeared for 70 days, but then 13 months later, another phenomenon was recorded. It was recorded on the Jiayu day of the third month or the third year of Jianping. There appeared to be a bold star in Aquila. Now, this corresponds to the star at Bethlehem. Now, you read the Bible, actually there were two stars, right? We know that the wise men first saw the star and they came. But after they arrived in Jerusalem, they couldn't see the star. Otherwise, they wouldn't need to ask and went to see King Herod. So the Chinese say that it appeared for 70 days and it disappeared. But then 13 months later, another star appeared. And this is the star of Bethlehem. And I think this is the reason why King Herod talked to the wise men and discovered that it was more than a year ago that he first saw it. So he decided to kill the children 2 years and under. So there is a reason for that. And then finally, in the interest of time, I'm going quickly here. 30 over years later, the Bible recorded on the day of the cross, it was about the 6th hour, the darkness fell. 6th hour is about noon, over the whole land until the 9th hour, because the sun was obscured. And the veil of the temple was torn in two, and Jesus crying out with a loud voice said, Father, into your hands I commit my spirit. Having said this, he breathed his last. Did the Chinese see it and record it? Yes, of course, the Chinese did. In the day of Gui Hai, the last day of the month, this was 33 years later than the phenomena that was recorded earlier. The sun was eclipsed or shrouded. The emperor avoided entering the throne room, withheld all military activities, and did not handle official business for 5 days. And he made an official announcement proclaiming that my poor character has caused this calamity, that the sun and the moon were veiled. I'm fearful and trembling. What else can I say? Anyone who presents a memorial is not allowed to mention the word holy. This is the original Chinese. And then there were other commentaries and response to this event. On the 4th month, on the day of Renwu, the imperial edict reads, Yin and Yang have mistakenly switched, referring to that event. And the sun and the moon were eclipsed. Now here, eclipse means covered up. The sins of all the people are now on one man. The emperor proclaims pardon to all under heaven. Now, wouldn't this be a perfect commentary on the day of the cross? Wouldn't this be what happened in Jerusalem? That the sins of the world are now on one man, on Jesus. Now, even more interestingly, another commentator, Qian Tan Ba, said eclipse on the day of Gui Hai means that the man from heaven dies. Very interestingly, if you understand Chinese, this word for death, Pen, it's only a reference to the king or the emperor. All right, people die, 死, but the emperor dies, it's Pen. So isn't Jesus the Tianren, the man from heaven? Tianren meaning heavenly man. That actually means as well as God and man. He is the true God-man. And that the Chinese understood that shrouding of the sun and the moon reference, that the heavenly man dies, and that heavenly man was a king, because the word they use for death refers to the king. So this is amazing. And if you ask me how do they know, I do not know how, but they practice this for a few thousand years. Um, the knowledge is lost to us, but they received the prophetic word, and they understand the prophecy, and they were able to decipher them and interpret them for us. So anyway, this is what I have to share, and maybe now we can have some. Okay, if you are familiar with the Chinese word dragon, let me see if I can pull it out. The complicated form tells you that it is not a auspicious word. So when Chinese call themselves Long the Chuanren, it was actually it is a mistake, because from the word, from the study of the word, you know that. Let me see, I can pull this out. All right, can you see it now? Can you see it?
Yeah.
Okay, all right. This is a classical form, right? You can see on the right side is more like the concrete form. You can see like the scale. So experts think that they were the crocodiles in the Yangtze River. And this is the ancient form. This is the classical form, and of course, the new form is the simplified form. In the classical form, people think that the 部首 is sleep, stand, but actually it is not. In the classical form, it tells you sin. Remember the word for bitterness, 辛苦的辛. Every word that has this radical is a bitter word. In other words, it's not an auspicious word. So from this one point, I can argue that the dragon, at least when the word was first formed, was not seen as an auspicious animal. Otherwise, the Chinese wouldn't have used that radical to form this word. So this animal was not auspicious. And who was the first emperor that was called the Dragon Emperor? Qin Shi Huang. All right. Qin Shi Huang was the first person called the first emperor that was referred to as the dragon, and it was actually a graffiti on the cliff that says Gulong, the ancient dragon. Sounds like the book of Revelation, right? So actually, Qin Shi Huang was mad that he was called the old dragon. He was really angry. So from that historical record, we know that being called the dragon was not a nice thing. That the people were not happy with him. He was oppressive, and so they called him the old dragon, Wulong, right? The first time an emperor was referred to as a dragon. Then unfortunately, over time, that has become identified with the emperor, and then the Chinese people wrongfully call themselves descendant of the dragon, but we know that it was not auspicious. And guess what? John talks about there were antichrists that had already arisen. Now, around that, and this was Qin Shi Huang 200 years before Christ. I think he was an example of an antichrist. He burned the scholars, and he buried the scholars. He burned the books that had a reference to Shanti, some of those things I shared with you, because he wanted to erase the name of God. And I think I also mentioned that when he ruled over all of China, he wanted the new title. And at that time, the title of the king was Da Wang, the great king. But some suggested, oh, maybe you call yourself Ah Wang, like later Xiang Yu chose for himself. He says, no, I shall call myself Huang Di. Remember, I showed you that the full honorific title for Shangdi is Huang Tian Shangdi. So basically, he wanted to usurp the role of God, and he called himself Huang Di. And this is interesting, right? He standardized everything. He standardized the Chinese written words, that. He standardized the measurement, and guess what unit that he used. He chose 6. All right, everything is 6, so 666. And the color he chose for his dynasty was black. Black was the color for the Qing dynasty. So anyway, that is the dragon, and I really think that it is a mistake for the Chinese people to call themselves descendant of the dragons, because our ancestors disliked the dragon, and when they hated Qin Shi Huang, they call him the old dragon.